The room went silent the moment they escorted me out with a cardboard box in my hands. Silent in that way only corporate hallways get when everyone pretends not to see a public execution. I still remember the smirk on the COO's face as he said, "Security will walk you out. We don't need you anymore." What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that firing the lead cryptographer of a defense contractor doesn't just end a career. Sometimes it starts an investigation. I had spent 14 years building systems no one in that building truly understood. Encrypted military communications, zero-trust architectures, black box protocols designed so that even executives couldn't see what was under the hood. That was the point. I wasn't there to be visible. I was there to make sure classified information never fell into the wrong hands. But when a new executive team arrived, MBA-heavy, ego-driven, obsessed with cost-cutting, they saw me as expensive, difficult, and inconvenient. I asked too many questions. I refused shortcuts. I blocked temporary access requests that violated federal compliance. And when I flagged irregular data exports tied to an overseas subcontractor, they told me to stay in my lane. So they fired me. No transition, no handover, no authorization review. Just a badge swipe revoked and a cardboard box shoved into my arms. What they didn't realize was that my termination automatically triggered something far bigger than HR paperwork. Buried deep inside our compliance framework was a mandatory reporting protocol tied directly to my role. If the lead cryptographer lost clearance access without an approved government transition, the system sent encrypted alerts, silent, automatic, and irreversible, to multiple oversight bodies, including military counterintelligence. I didn't call anyone. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply went home. 3 days later, at exactly 9:17 a.m., black vehicles rolled up to the building. I wasn't there, but I heard later how it unfolded. Military police, federal investigators, cybercrime units. No warnings, no smiles. Executives were pulled into conference rooms one by one while servers were seized and access logs frozen. The same COO who smirked during my termination was reportedly shaking when an officer asked him to explain why restricted cryptographic keys had been mirrored to a non-approved foreign node. Turns out, the irregular data exports I warned them about weren't minor. They were catastrophic. In their rush to cut costs and boost quarterly numbers, leadership had approved an unauthorized integration with a third-party analytics firm, one with indirect foreign state ties. They didn't understand what data they were touching. They didn't realize that even encrypted metadata patterns could compromise military operations. And when I refused to sign off on it, they removed the obstacle, me. But systems don't forget just because people do. As investigators dug deeper, they found emails, executives overriding security objections, dismissing compliance risks, mocking over-engineered paranoia. They found my reports, my warnings, my documented refusals. And right there in the timeline was the moment I was fired, 2 days after flagging the breach as a potential national security threat. That's when the tone changed. The company's contracts were frozen within hours. Press statements collapsed into silence. Board members suddenly resigned for personal reasons. And the COO, he was escorted out in handcuffs before sunset, accused of gross negligence and obstruction. A week later, I received a call, not from the company, but from a federal liaison. They thanked me, not for revenge, not for whistleblowing theatrics, but for building a system that protected the country even when its creators were removed. I never went back to that office. I didn't need to. My role had already done its job. Months later, I accepted a position with a government research division, quiet, classified, far away from corporate politics. The company that fired me never recovered its reputation. In the industry, its name became shorthand for a single lesson whispered in executive circles. You can fire an employee. But if you fire the guardian without understanding the gate, don't be surprised when the guards arrive. And the most ironic part, they thought they were saving money. Instead, they paid the price of arrogance, measured not in dollars, but in flashing lights, sealed doors, and the unmistakable sound of boots echoing through a boardroom that suddenly understood exactly who they had just underestimated. Officially, the investigation was ongoing. which in government language meant everything you think you know is only the surface. Behind the scenes, the company's remaining leadership was summoned repeatedly for interviews that stretched late into the night. Phones were cloned, emails reconstructed, backup servers pulled from off-site vaults they had forgotten even existed. Every decision they made while chasing growth was now being re-examined through the cold, unforgiving lens of national security law. And slowly, a pattern emerged. The executives hadn't just ignored my warnings, they had built a culture around ignoring expertise. Security teams were sidelined. Compliance reports were softened before reaching the board. Engineers who pushed back were labeled difficult. Promotions went to those who said yes, not those who asked why. I hadn't been an anomaly. I had been the last line that refused to bend. Once that line was removed, everything behind it collapsed. What stunned investigators most wasn't the breach itself, but how avoidable it had been. My internal memos were now exhibits. My refusal to approve the data pipeline was cited word for word in federal briefings. The same phrases that once got me labeled uncooperative were now being read aloud in secure rooms as proof that the company had knowingly stepped outside the law. The irony was impossible to miss. The company issued a public statement claiming my role had been non-critical. 2 days later, the government classified my former position as mission essential. Internally, panic set in. Engineers scrambled to rebuild systems they had never understood. Consultants were flown in at obscene hourly rates, only to quietly admit they couldn't reconstruct what had been dismantled. Encryption keys were missing, not lost, but locked behind protocols no one left behind knew how to access. Entire projects froze not because of raids, but because the knowledge had walked out the door in a cardboard box. I watched all of this from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a strange calm. Because the truth was simple, I had done my job. I warned them. I documented everything. I designed safeguards that didn't rely on goodwill or intelligence at the top. When they removed me, the system responded exactly as it was supposed to. Revenge implies intent. This wasn't revenge, it was consequence. Months later, a former colleague reached out quietly. He told me the building felt different now, quieter, heavier. No more swagger in the halls, no more jokes about paranoid security guys. People spoke carefully. They double-checked permissions. They read policies instead of skimming them. Fear had replaced arrogance and humility followed close behind. He asked if I ever regretted not fighting my firing. I didn't, because if I had stayed, if I had begged, argued, or compromised, none of it would have stopped. The breach would have deepened, the exposure would have spread, and the cost wouldn't have been reputational or financial. It would have been measured in lives. That's what they never understood. Some roles exist not to make profit, not to impress shareholders, not to smile in boardrooms, but to prevent disasters no one ever gets credit for avoiding. They fired the lead cryptographer thinking they were removing friction. Instead, they removed the silence that kept them safe. And when the military police arrived, it wasn't because of me. It was because the system finally spoke louder than the people who tried to ignore it. After the initial raids, the silence became the most unsettling part. No press conferences, no denials, no triumphant executives claiming misunderstanding, just quiet. Contracts that once brought in billions were suspended pending review. Government partners stopped returning calls. Projects were frozen mid-development, their funding locked behind layers of approvals that would never come. The company's stock slid slowly at first, then sharply, as analysts began to realize something fundamental had broken, not a product, not a timeline, but trust. And trust, once lost in defense work, doesn't regenerate. Behind closed doors, investigators began mapping accountability. Not just who approved what, but who ignored whom. That's where my name kept resurfacing, not as a suspect, but as a reference point. The last person who said no. The last signature missing before a chain of reckless decisions. The last professional barrier between compliance and catastrophe. Executives who once dismissed me were now explaining under oath why they thought cryptographic safeguards were over-engineered, why they approved access without clearance, why they overruled security objections without consulting federal liaisons. Every justification sounded thinner when spoken aloud, stripped of boardroom bravado. One by one, careers ended, not with firings but with barred futures, blacklists, revoked clearances. Quiet advisories circulated among contractors warning against rehiring certain names. In this world, you don't need prison to end a career. You just need to lose trust. Meanwhile, the industry adjusted. Other firms took notice. Emergency audits rolled out across defense contractors. Encryption protocols were reviewed. Roles like mine, once viewed as expensive overhead, were suddenly elevated, protected, documented. Companies rewrote policies so that no single executive could override security without external approval. My firing became a case study, passed around in secure briefings under titles like Organizational Failure through Executive Overreach. I never appeared in those rooms. I didn't need to. My work was already there. Months later, I stood in a very different facility, windowless, quiet, humming with machines whose purpose would never be explained to outsiders. My new badge carried no company logo, no flashy title, just an access level and a reminder of responsibility. The people around me didn't ask about my past. In this environment, survival depended on competence, not charisma. One evening, as I reviewed a system integrity report, it struck me how invisible this work still was and how necessary. If we did everything right, nothing would happen. No headlines, no applause, just silence. And that was the goal. Occasionally, I'd see a news article about my former employer. Another lawsuit settled. Another contract officially terminated. Another executive stepping away. The company itself still existed, but hollowed out, reduced to a cautionary shell of what happens when leadership confuses authority with understanding. I felt no urge to correct the narrative, no desire to reclaim credit, because the lesson didn't belong to me. It belonged to every organization that believes expertise is optional. To every executive who thinks removing the person who says no will make problems disappear. To every board that forgets some employees aren't there to generate profit but to prevent disaster. They fired the lead cryptographer. The military police arrived. And long after the vehicles left, the echo remained, not of sirens or boots but of a truth too often ignored. You can silence a warning. You can remove a person. But you cannot outrun the consequences of ignoring the systems that keep you safe. That's not revenge. That's reality doing its job. Years later, when the dust had fully settled, people still spoke about that company in lowered voices. Not because it collapsed overnight. It didn't. It limped on, stripped of its prestige, reduced to minor subcontracting work far from sensitive systems. But in defense and intelligence circles, its name became shorthand for a single, unforgivable failure. They didn't understand what they were guarding. I encountered the story again in an unexpected way. During a closed-door symposium on secure systems design, a senior official referenced a case study. He didn't name names, but I recognized every detail. The unauthorized data pipeline, the executive override, the termination of a mission-critical role without clearance review. He paused after explaining how the breach had been detected. The most important factor, he said, was not the investigation itself. It was the system that escalated automatically when expertise was removed. There were nods around the room. Good systems, he continued, assume failure. They don't rely on people always doing the right thing. I sat there quietly, listening as my past work was dissected, improved upon, and elevated into a model for future infrastructure. What once lived only in my head and in obscure documentation was now shaping policy, quietly, methodically, permanently. After the symposium, a younger engineer approached me. "I heard you were involved in that case," she said carefully. "How did you know when to stop fighting and let the system take over?" I thought about it for a moment. "Because systems exist for moments when people stop listening," I said. "If you have to shout to be heard, something's already broken." She nodded, thoughtful, and walked away. That conversation stayed with me, because it captured the real ending of the story, not the raids, not the investigations, not the corporate downfall, but the understanding that followed. The realization that expertise isn't loud, that the most dangerous failures don't come from malice but from ignorance paired with authority. I never returned to corporate life. I didn't miss it. I continued working in spaces where the consequences of decisions were understood, where no was treated as a safeguard, not an obstacle. And sometimes, late at night, I'd think back to that day in the hallway, the cardboard box, the smirk, the finality of being escorted out. What they saw as an ending was simply a transfer of responsibility, from human arrogance to system integrity. They fired the lead cryptographer, and the systems did exactly what they were built to do. In the end, no one got revenge. Something far more important happened. The truth was enforced. And even after all that time, the lesson kept resurfacing in places no one expected. New companies would bring me in not for flashy innovation but for quiet reviews. They didn't ask, "How do we grow faster?" They asked, "What could destroy us if we're careless?" That shift alone told me the story had done its work. Fear had matured into respect. I would sit in sterile conference rooms, listening to executives explain their systems with confidence that sounded familiar, too familiar. And gently, methodically, I would ask the questions they hadn't considered. Who controls the keys? Who can override safeguards? What happens if this role disappears overnight? What triggers escalation when authority ignores expertise? Sometimes the room would go still, because once you ask those questions, you can't unhear them. More than once, a CEO pulled me aside afterward and said, "We had someone like you once. They left. We didn't think it mattered." I never corrected them. Years earlier, I might have tried to explain, to convince, to warn louder. Now I understood something fundamental. People only hear consequences when they arrive dressed as reality. The company that fired me eventually faded from relevance. No dramatic collapse. No final scandal. Just a slow erosion, talent draining away, contracts drying up, trust evaporating. In the end, they weren't defeated by an enemy or a competitor. They were defeated by what they refused to understand. Every so often, I still see the phrase cost optimization used the way they used it, like a spell that excuses everything. And I think back to that moment in the hallway, the box in my hands, the false confidence in their voices. They thought they were removing a problem. What they actually removed was awareness. And awareness has a way of returning, sometimes in the form of audits, sometimes in investigations, sometimes in black vehicles pulling up without warning. That's the part no one advertises. Not all revenge is personal, not all justice is emotional, and not all consequences announce themselves with anger. Some are silent, some are automatic, some are built into systems long before anyone realizes they'll need them. They fired the lead cryptographer. Nothing happened immediately. And that's what fooled them, because the most powerful responses don't rush. They wait, they gather evidence, they follow protocol, and when they finally arrive, they don't argue. They simply enforce the truth. In the end, the story wasn't about a firing or an investigation or even the arrival of military police. It was about a misunderstanding so common it feels harmless, until it is. They believed expertise was optional. They believed authority outweighed understanding. They believed systems existed to serve leadership, not to restrain it. They were wrong. The moment they removed the one person whose job was to say no, the system did exactly what it was designed to do. It spoke on behalf of the risks they chose to ignore. No anger, no revenge, just protocol, escalation, and consequence. I didn't win. They didn't lose. Reality corrected the imbalance. Years later, no one remembers the executive meetings, the smirks, or the hallway where it all began. But the policies changed. The safeguards remained. And somewhere in countless organizations, systems now ask harder questions before allowing dangerous shortcuts. That is the quiet legacy of the lead cryptographer. Not a name, not a headline, but a rule embedded so deeply that it activates when ego replaces judgment. They fired the lead cryptographer. The military police arrived. And long after the sirens faded, one truth remained, unmovable and absolute. You can remove a person. You cannot remove the responsibility they were protecting.